On today's World Insight, the United States Court of International Trade versus Trump administration tariffs. What's next after the court rules against most of the sweeping tariffs since Trump took office? Why the court decision? Could the Trump tariffs hold?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. U.S. President Donald Trump announced on May the 30th an order to double tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to 50%. Meanwhile, Trump administration advisors remain confident tariffs will hold, as they say, after the United States Court of International Trade ruled last Wednesday that the U.S. president lacked the authority to impose tariffs on imports from most countries. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick even said recently, rest assured, tariffs are not going away. They insist that tariffs will remain in place or the administration will find new ways, as they say, to carry them out. Amid the court battle over U.S. tariffs, what does it mean for the rest of the world? How would the U.S. trading partners articulate their stance in the process? How could the decision affect the global consumers and trade relations? Time to hear from today's panelists. For more insights, we have in Beijing Dr. Zhao Hai, Director of the International Political Studies with National Institute for Global Strategy. In Washington, D.C., Manuel Menendez, founder and CEO of MCM Group Holding. In Portland, USA, Yan Liang, Creamer Chair, Professor of Economics with Willamette University. And last but not least, in New Orleans, Louisiana, Professor James Viator, Adams and Rees Distinguished Professor with Loyola College of Law. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, there has been interactions between Washington and Beijing about whose fault is it that not necessarily the results of the Geneva talk has accomplished all.
So we hear from President Trump that he said that China has violated the Geneva Agreement without disclosing any details. And his trade representative here basically said that China was slow in crawling back of the export controls on rare earth minerals. But from China's perspective, especially when you hear the spokesperson from the Commerce Ministry, what they said is the United States was the one that actually violated the consensus that were reached in Geneva. And what the US has done since the Geneva meeting was that they expanded the export controls on AI chips to China. They also controlled the exports of chip design softwares to China. And very recently, they also aggressively revoked the Chinese students' visa. So all of these, I think, are really undermining the spirit of cooperation and goodwill in carry through more trade negotiations. So it's unclear at this point whether or not both sides will back down. But it is clear that I think there are many tensions that are still remaining between the two countries at this point.
Manuel, your thoughts?
I think having one meeting in Geneva is just a starting point. I think what's missing in the equation right now is more frequent conversation. People have to get back together quickly. And I'm hoping that the big meeting happens between President Trump and President Xi, because I think that's the missing ingredient.
There were talks about so-called phone calls. Are you suggesting a person-to-person meeting, or are you suggesting a phone call? These two are very different.
Preference would be face-to-face meeting, but in lieu of a face-to-face meeting, at least have the call, because there's back and forth that they had contact and then there's no contact. But I think we have to get the leaders together, the two largest economies in the world, talking in order to get the direction of both countries aligned and do it quickly, because it's having impacts globally, not just in China, not just in the US, but it has global impacts that are unnecessary and ridiculous, actually. And I think Warren Buffett said it very well. I'm just reading my note here. He said, we should do what we do best and other countries should do what they do best. All nations thrive through cooperation. We have to get to the model of sitting down and talking through issues and do it quickly.
Professor Liang, what do you think now? 90 days is almost reaching. We hear, quote unquote, ultimatum coming out of the current White House toward its trading partners around the world, and yet its trading partners around the world are having very different voices as to if you are Washington not lowering permanently the earlier tariffs, then we're gonna also reciprocally grant tariffs on you. So we are seeing an escalation of tensions.
You're right. I think that goes back to the question, which country is not really, putting in good faith in trying to have the trade negotiations. I think China is not the only country who, now having sort of a setback with the United States. When you look at Japan, for example, after 4 rounds of negotiations, they were going back home to empty-handed, and they are coming to, hoping that there will be person-to-person meetings when the G7 meeting on the sideline. So I think that just clearly shows that the United States is probably demanding too much and not making concessions and not really, having the good faith in carrying out these kinds of trade negotiations. And we do know that trade negotiations do take time, and it's very difficult. Last time when China reached the phase 1 trade deal with the US, it took almost a year and a half. So 90 days is really not sufficient, I think, to iron out a lot of the disagreements and so on and so forth. But again, I think, the writing is really on the wall. We see all these actions taken by the United States now with another, 50%, right? The increase in the tariffs on steel and aluminum. I think many trading partners feel frustrated in this process. And again, I think that the Chinese has agreed at Geneva that they will roll back some of these export controls of rare earths and minerals that were started after April the 2nd. But let's not forget that there are some of these mineral restrictions were put in place before the April the 2nd. So
Right.
I think it's very unclear at this point exactly what the Trump administration demands from China and what they expect from China. And yet they're carrying out all these very visible actions that undermine, the goodwill when it comes to trade negotiations.
Professor Viator, it is not China single-handedly actually complaining about what exactly Washington wants, especially this administration. We hear similar complaints coming from Japan, Australia, just to name a few. Negotiators suggesting coming out of the negotiation room and say, what exactly did they want? And they are not telling us, even if we ask them directly. So what that say is about the logic of negotiation when it comes to trade issues. What do you think, Professor Viator?
Well, I think the first thing, successful diplomacy has to be diplomatic. So assigning blame and complaining is not diplomatic. Speaking calmly without pressuring or name calling the other party is diplomatic. And I agree with Manny that that's what's needed. And deadlines are written to be broken. And so the 90-day deadline, I don't think should be a showstopper if people are really interested in moving forward. And finally, to read The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump before he was president, he likes to go into negotiations with lots of bargaining chips so he can give things away. And so a lot of these demands, actions, et cetera, will change as discussions go forward. And I certainly agree that diplomacy is a two-way street, and you need the two principal parties to sit down in a room and then not carry on negotiations in front of the television cameras after they leave the room. It should all be done in the room.
But we all know, it is well known that the current White House is having a very different style. So can the trading partners of the United States be able to have a very different attitude and style compared to the current Washington?
Real estate deals in New York City are a contact sport. And that's where President Trump learned to negotiate. So I think trading partners will just have to learn about how a contact sport is played and play it only in the room and don't complain about it inside of the room.
What about the urgency coming from within Washington between the executive branch and also the judicial branch? As we know, earlier there were pause of the Trump reciprocal tariffs as a result of legal matters. So what about now?
The two major judicial procedures are the two district court opinions where Trump's tariffs, various of his tariffs, both China and general, the Liberation Day tariffs and then the more particular tariffs pointed at various trading partners. All of those were declared unconstitutional. And now the judicial appeals process will go forth. First, they have to go to the Intermediate Court of Appeal. Then certainly it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's going to take way more than 90 days, even if it gets onto the emergency docket of the United States Supreme Court. So that's why I think the 90-day thought should basically be disregarded, because those tariffs are the major bargaining chip in President Trump's view, I think. And so those lower court opinions need to be, from the Trump administration's viewpoint, need to be overturned by either the appellate courts or finally by the Supreme Court, because those are the two big bargaining chips. And so I don't think much will happen in negotiations until those two bargaining chips come back into play. That is, if the Supreme Court reverses the lower court opinions. If the lower court opinions are not reversed, then fast recalibration will be necessary for other bargaining chips to bring to the table. I think everyone agrees those are the two big bargaining chips that Trump is holding. Until the judicial process is finished, he doesn't know for sure whether he has those chips to play with.
Over the weekend, we have seen many in some of the TV talk shows that are crucial for the policymakers. Some of the Trump administration officials coming out and suggest to the media, see, what we have suggested, even if there is tremendous tariff against our trading partners, the prices in the United States are not necessarily going high, or at least for now. What do you make of this argument?
I think it's a false argument. I think that the price, it's a timing issue. I think if this tariff war continues, you will see definitely higher prices. I think I just want to read what our Treasury Secretary said. He said, this is Jerome Powell, sustaining these larger than expected tariffs will result in higher costs, higher prices, rising inflation, and an increasing risk of recession. So it's a timing issue. There's a supply chain and there's inventories, but when that inventory is dropped down and then people have to start paying more, you're going to see companies pass along those tariff increases to consumers. You're going to see shelves with empty shelves of products that would be coming typically from China and other countries. It's going to happen. But we're in this state of back and forth legal issues and imposing. This is not the way forward. There's only losers in a trade war. There's no winners.
We understand that there are certain media reports suggesting that as the tariffs being inflicted on the U.S. trading partners, such as China, Chinese exports gonna suck it most of the cost, more than 60%. That's according to some media reports. Of course, the Chinese side immediately came out and suggests that is not true. The exporters are not going to do that. What do you make of that? These kind of, back and forth reports about who's going to suck the cost?
Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear that the goal of the Trump administration's current policy is very clear, which is to raise the tariff. No matter what the legal battle is going on, no matter what policy shifts, the ultimate goal that Trump has already made it very clear since his first administration, which is to raise the tariff, bring back protectionism, reshoring American industrial capacity, and also increase federal revenue. So that is very clear. No matter how the current reality show is going, that ultimate goal is very clear. For who's actually taking the burden of raising cost, it's also very clear that previous academic research all show that American consumer will ultimately bear the brunt of the raising price. The current misperception of the Trump administration and Trump himself is deriving from the first sort of trade war between the United States and China. Back then, because of exchange rate fluctuation, because of the importers taking a lot of sort of internally digested most of the cost, Trump believed that there's no bigger or significant price rising on the U.S. side. And therefore, he got the misperception that somehow raising tariff, if not big enough, trying to use that negotiation tactic will prevent a significant rise of price within the United States. However, this time around is very different because when U.S. raised tariff, the U.S. dollar is not rising, it's actually declining, and therefore contributing to the further possibility of rising price in the United States. And also because this time the battle is around the world, it's not just with China, and therefore all of the price will go up together, and it's very difficult to get around of this tariff war.
Professor Viator, what do you make of the latest judicial and executive branch tug of war, so to speak? It is not only in the issue of tariffs, but also reflected on the issues of whether certain universities in the United States will have the permission to welcome international students, and whether the executive branch has the power to revoke Chinese students' visa, and the list goes on. So do you see similar nature between these two very different issues, or actually they are handled quite differently because they deal with, both, because the nature of these two issues, one is more domestic, the other is more toward U.S. trading partners?
I see them not as domestic international differences, but as government power differences. Immigration administration is an executive branch function. And so the executive branch has always had, the president has always had great leeway through the State Department to implement American immigration policy. You saw with the prior administration, they chose not to implement congressional immigration policy. They did not effectively enforce the law. By the same token, the State Department and the Internal Revenue Service can be brought into immigration matters in terms of federal funds to colleges that are violating American laws. There's a famous case involving Bob Jones University from 1983. Bob Jones University was violating civil rights laws, not allowing interracial dating on campus. The IRS did an investigation and removed their 501c3 charitable non-taxable entity status. That's the sort of thing President Trump is probably going to do vis-a-vis Harvard with their violation of civil rights laws vis-a-vis harassment of Jewish students. So that's one topic. Great executive authority through the IRS and the State Department in those areas.
Even though we see the court is having a very different conclusion for now, that is to let Harvard continue with the incorporating of international students and not revoke.
Those are lower court.
Yes, indeed. It's not the Supreme Court.
They will be decided at the intermediate appellate court and Supreme Court level eventually. So
right.
The district court opinions don't matter because all of the injunctions have been stayed pending appeal. So those district court opinions are not effective. And we won't know until either the appellate courts or the intermediate appellate courts or the Supreme Court make the decision. But the executive branch has much more authority in the area of State Department, visas, tax exemptions, etc. Tariffs is different, but Professor Menendez mentioned earlier the Smoot-Hawley tariff. The Smoot-Hawley tariff gives President Trump all of the authority he needs to impose up to 50% tariff increases unilaterally with no finding by any other branch of government, no declaration of emergency. The Smoot-Hawley tariff in Section 1338 gives the president plenary authority when he finds that the commerce of the United States has been interfered with by foreign governments and foreign entities, to raise tariffs up to 50% on those foreign governments. I think the Supreme Court will use that statute from 1930, it's still on the books, never repealed, in order to declare Trump's tariffs constitutional, which means back to the bargaining table with China and other trading partners. And those are the big chips that will be in play, because I'm fairly certain they will be held within the constitutional authority of the president, delegated to the president by Congress.
Got it, Professor. So, Professor Liang, my question to you is more specific. That is, how do you see the current administration could also use this legal process as accurately as Professor Viator suggested, to as a tool to, shall I say, firm up its position when it comes to negotiation with its trading partners?
I mean, if he does get all the legal backing that he needs, which again, I'm not opposing what the professor had just said. What I'm saying is that, you know, if you get the Congress, right, to delegate this this to the president, then yes, there is a case to be made that he's get all his legal backings to impose all these universal tariffs and sector-specific tariffs and what have you. But you're right, I don't think the trading partners would really see this as a way would bind them to come to negotiation tables and make compromises. I think, you know, again, Japan is a very interesting example, right? Japan, by any means, is not in a very strong position bargaining with the United States when, you know, you still have the military occupation and you still have a lot of economic dependency on the United States. And yet, I think, you know, China, not to mention China, right? I think many countries would have to take their own national interests into consideration and also abide by the international law. I mean, we haven't talked about WTO in this whole trade negotiations. I think this whole multilateral trading system, right, if it's still, you know, it's a thing, then I think all of this should be really go through the multilateral trading system and not to have this kinds of unilateral or bilateral negotiations where Trump is basically criticizing a lot of these legal battles in order to, you know, do his own, you know, policy favor. Not to mention, I think a lot of these policies, as I mentioned earlier, are really self-inflicting wounds and also self-defeating policies when it comes to his own economic and non-economic objectives.
All right. Dr. Zhao, your thoughts?
This is not a legal thing. This is political. From the very beginning, Trump is a populist leader, and he is satisfying his base in terms of raising protectionism in the United States and trying to satisfy the sort of working class demands of retrieving jobs from overseas and stop outsourcing to the outside of the United States. And so far, tariff is the most important tool, instrument in his hand. And he's going to continue to play that, continue to use that, regardless of what section of trade law he's using, what reason he's using. Ultimately, he's just going to play that to the utmost so that he can gain most political favor or support from his base. And so far, if you look at the polls, interestingly, even though the majority of the United States people is against the tariff, but also there's a very strong 1/3 or bigger than 1/3 portion of the U.S. population, I mean voters, they're supporting Trump's tariff policy in terms of dealing with the trade deficit. So far, I think Trump will look at the polling, look at the popular feeling, the popular sentiment, and to decide whether or not he's going to proceed to further increase tariff or to somehow pause or reduce or temporarily stop his tariff war. And he's just, not really looking at the legal process. He's looking at the political process within the United States.
Many outside the United States, Mr. Menendez, are quite skeptical about this process, even if there is the division of executive and also the judicial, because people are looking at the tremendous pressure the current administration, before even coming into the office, putting on legal workers, including some of the law firms who have very different political opinions with the current administration. Meanwhile, they're also looking at the individuals of judges within the Supreme Court. Some of them are certainly were embracing the position when Trump was in was the president for the very first term. So people are quite skeptical about whether this judicial system would really serve the purpose of bringing the reasoning back to the United States when it comes to trade.
And I think that it just has to go through our system. It's painful. It's a painful process. But I think part of some of the other speakers have alluded to this. Part of the strategy and the tactics are used, whether it's Harvard we're talking about, or talking about international students, or tariffs. The tactic that's being used, and I don't think it's appropriate, is go to court, test the system, test the law, and then let the courts decide. And there's also two types of buckets. There's policy buckets of rules, and there's structural issues. Structural issues take a long time to work on, but policies issues you can change quite quickly. And I think that we need to get back to the table because the world is counting on China and the United States to work out their differences. And we must do that quickly.
Finally, before we go, I do want to ask every one of you, and please provide a brief answer. At the end of the day, when we are looking at all these possibilities about policies, about interactions, about the end game, what is the best way to distinguish postures and rhetorics vis-a-vis real actions and also real directions? Professor Viator.
It depends on lots of time spent together. Mr. Menendez is absolutely right about that. Lots of talking to get through the rhetoric to find out what each party is really interested in and most wants. And that just takes time. And as far as the courts being involved, the job of the courts is only to say whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional, or an action of the president is constitutional or unconstitutional. As I tell my students, just because something is stupid, just because Congress passes a stupid law or a president does a stupid executive order, doesn't make it unconstitutional. And so all the courts are going to evaluate is whether the president has the authority to impose these tariffs, not whether they're a good idea. They're probably a very bad idea. But the courts are not going to be involved in that question.
And it might be a 4-year up and down, back and forth game. But remember, there's countries and then there's leaders. Leaders change, but countries' policies, I think, will stand strong in the end. And U.S.-China relations will prevail ultimately in the end.
I think the U.S. is deflecting. It's blaming China and trading partners for the U.S.'s own structural problems that needs to be fixed. And I think that, Donald Trump is very good in using all this rhetoric and talking about working for their working class. But the matter of fact is that manufacturing only accounts for less than 10% of the jobs in the US. And all these tariffs are paid by low-income working families. And so I don't think that rhetoric that he is actually waging is really, for the real interest of the US's middle class.
Thank you so much, Yan Liang, Manuel Menendez, and also James Viator. Also our appreciation to Dr. Zhao Hai earlier in the program. We are looking forward to another round of discussion on these issues and more. Thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.